I knew something was off the second I saw Darla Newcomb marching across my front pasture in her wedge heels and oversized sunglasses, holding a clipboard like it was a sword. She looked like she was on a mission, and judging by the way she was glaring at my fence line, I was about to be her new target. "I'm going to need you to remove that fence, Mr. Thorne," she said, not even bothering with a hello. "The name's Xander Thorne," I said, standing from where I'd been patching up the chicken coop. "And that fence has been there for 20 years. It marks the boundary of my property." Darla scoffed like I just told her the sky was green. "That land is within the jurisdiction of the Harmony Trails HOA, and our records show it belongs to the community commons." I laughed, not because it was funny but because it was so wildly false. "That's my land. I've got the deed and the survey to prove it. Harmony Trails stops at the creek, and you know it." She shook her head like I was a kid who didn't understand math. "Well, we've reviewed the boundaries and the HOA board agrees. You've encroached on community land. You'll need to vacate that area and take down all structures within 30 days, or we'll pursue legal action." I stared at her. This woman was trying to seize 5 acres of working ranch land, my goat pen, my tool shed, and part of my orchard, all because she suddenly decided it was community property? I wasn't having it. I'd bought this ranch 10 years ago, well before the HOA even existed. When the suburban sprawl crept in and Harmony Trails was built next door, I made it clear to the developers that my ranch wasn't part of their plan. They agreed. I stayed out of their meetings and they stayed off my land. Until now. Later that week, I started getting letters. Notice of violation. Non-compliance penalty. Fake fines from the HOA claiming I owed thousands for unauthorized use of land and failure to maintain communal property. It was a joke, except they were serious. And so was I. I went down to the county assessor's office and pulled every map, deed, and record I could find. My property lines hadn't changed. But the kicker? The HOA had recently filed a forged, updated plat showing my 5-acre stretch as part of their greenbelt. It was signed by none other than Darla Newcomb, HOA president. I took copies. Every page. The next day, I came home to find 2 men in reflective vests and a backhoe parked right on my gravel road. One of them pointed toward my tool shed and orchard. "We're here to clear the area for the new community garden." "You set foot on my land with that thing," I said, stepping between them and the machine, "and you'll be dealing with the sheriff." They hesitated, but Darla's Lexus rolled up seconds later. She stepped out like she owned the place. "This is happening today," she said. "You're in violation, and we've given you notice." I pulled out my phone and hit record. "This land is mine. I've got the documents to prove it. You so much as scratch that fence, and you're trespassing." She didn't back down. She waved at the contractors. "Do it." But they didn't. One of them looked at me, then at her. "Ma'am, if he says it's private land, we're not touching it without a court order." She stomped back to her car, muttering something about legal action. I knew then I had to make the next move. I wasn't just going to defend my land, I was going to drag her entire HOA circus into court and expose everything. The fake maps, the forged documents, the harassment. And if I played it right, Darla wouldn't just lose her power trip, she'd lose her freedom. The following Monday, I walked into the county clerk's office with a thick folder under my arm and a mission in my chest. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore, I was going to dig straight through whatever rock Darla had crawled out from under and expose every tunnel she'd carved through the legal system. "Xander Thorne," I said to the woman behind the glass. "I need to file a civil suit. Fraud, forgery, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property. And I've got the proof." She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. By sundown, I had paperwork filed against Harmony Trails HOA, Darla Newcomb personally, and 2 of the board members who'd signed off on the forged plat map. The county clerk gave me a court date. 3 weeks out. That gave me enough time to prepare, and I wasn't wasting a second. I called up Maggie Sue, a land use attorney I'd met years ago, when a gas company tried to sneak a pipeline through the back of my property. She remembered me, and more importantly, she owed me a favor. "I'll take it," she said after looking through the documents. But Xander, this isn't just a civil issue. That altered plat map? That's criminal. You should loop in the DA. She forwarded everything to the county prosecutor's office. Within 48 hours, an investigator reached out. I met him at a diner off Route 6, a quiet place where the waitresses knew when to top your coffee and when to walk away. You're saying this map was submitted to the county with forged signatures? Investigator Aldridge asked. He was tall, clean-shaven, and had the kind of voice that made people confess things they hadn't even done. Not just forged signatures, I said, sliding the original survey across the table. But they redrew boundaries that haven't changed in over 30 years. This is attempted land theft, plain and simple. Aldridge took his time reading, flipping between the fake plat and the real deed. You mind if I take this? Already made copies, I said. Take the original. He nodded, then tucked it into a manila envelope. If this checks out, they're in serious trouble. I'll be in touch. By the time I left the diner, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was locked in. This wasn't a feud, it was a takedown in progress. 3 days later, the sheriff's department rolled into Harmony Trails with a search warrant. They hit the HOA office, really just a rented room in the community clubhouse, and walked out with computers, files, and Darla's personal laptop. Word spread fast. Residents who'd once nodded politely but stayed out of my business were suddenly a lot more curious. That weekend, I hosted a barbecue. Not for fun, this was tactical. I invited everyone from Harmony Trails who'd ever had so much as a fence dispute with the HOA. And they came. They brought potato salad, folding chairs, and stories. I got fined for planting tomatoes too close to the sidewalk, said a retired nurse named Linda. They said it violated aesthetic guidelines. They made me repaint my house because the shade of blue wasn't harmonious with the natural environment, said a young dad named Carlos. But the color came from their own approved palette. It wasn't just pettiness, it was a pattern. Arbitrary rules, inconsistent enforcement, and in some cases, flat-out lies. Maggie joined us halfway through, listening and taking notes. By the end of the night, we had a list of 17 residents who'd been targeted or manipulated by Darla's board. The next week, subpoenas went out. Darla must have felt the heat because suddenly she was everywhere, posting flyers about misinformation, holding emergency board meetings, even going door to door claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. I caught her trying to talk to Carlos on his porch one evening. I stepped up the walkway, arms crossed. You really ought to quit while you're behind, I said. She turned, her voice syrupy. Xander, I'm trying to keep the community unified. This drama you're stirring up is hurting everyone. You altered legal documents and tried to seize land that doesn't belong to you, I said. That's not drama. That's a felony. Her eyes flickered just for a second. You don't understand how these things work. HOAs have authority, not enough to rewrite county maps. She didn't respond, just gave me a tight nod and walked off. That was the last time she tried to talk to me directly. Court came fast. The hearing was held in county civil court, a long rectangular room with too few windows and too many fluorescent lights. Maggie came armed with evidence, diagrams, and a witness list that included the original surveyor, 2 former board members who'd resigned over ethical concerns, and investigator Aldridge himself. Darla showed up with a lawyer who looked like he'd been hired off a billboard. Slick hair, loud tie, and absolutely no idea what kind of case he'd walked into. He tried to argue that the updated plat was a corrective measure, that the HOA had acted in good faith, and that any discrepancies were clerical. But then Aldridge took the stand. He walked the court through the forged map, the altered digital files, and the metadata showing exactly when and where the document had been created on Darla's laptop, 2 months before it had been submitted to the county. Then came the kicker. We also found email correspondence, Aldridge said, between Ms. Newcomb and 2 board members. In those emails, she explicitly discussed redrawing the boundaries to absorb non-conforming plots and bring difficult properties under board control. The judge turned to Darla's lawyer. Do you have a response? He stammered something about misinterpretation, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The court ruled in my favor. Not just a dismissal of all HOA claims against my land, but a full reversal. The judge ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees, declared the forged plat map null and void, and referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Darla didn't even look up as the gavel fell. She just sat there, staring at the table like it might open up and swallow her whole. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Word had spread fast: local news, legal blogs, even a regional podcast that covered HOA corruption. I didn't say much. Just this: if you give power to the wrong kind of people, they'll always come for what isn't theirs. But if you stand your ground and shine a light on the truth, they scatter like cockroaches. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The HOA board dissolved under pressure. The community elected a new committee, one that promised transparency and limited scope. They even invited me to join. I declined. I'd already fought the war. Now I just wanted to work my land, fix the barn roof before winter, and maybe plant more apple trees near the north fence. The funny thing about standing up to people like Darla, they count on you being quiet. They count on you folding. But they never count on you having the receipts, the patience, and the spine to drag them into the daylight. And that's exactly where I left her. 2 weeks after the court ruling, I got a call from investigator Aldridge just after dawn. His voice was calm, but there was a new edge to it. "We've unearthed additional documents," he said. "There's more going on than we thought." I set my coffee down. "What kind of more?" "Financial records. HOA funds were used for transactions that have nothing to do with community maintenance. We're talking contractor kickbacks, personal expenses, even a shell landscaping company registered to Darla's cousin in Nevada. You still have those resident complaints from the barbecue. They're in a folder by my desk." "Good. We'll need statements." The DA's office is opening a formal investigation into misappropriation of funds, conspiracy, and wire fraud. This may go federal. By noon, 2 unmarked sedans parked outside the now padlocked HOA clubhouse. I stood across the road with Carlos and Linda, watching as agents carried out boxes of files and a desktop tower wrapped in evidence tape. "What happens if she flees?" Carlos asked, eyes on the door. "She won't make it far," I said. "Her name's already on a list." Things moved quickly after that. Subpoenas expanded to include Darla's emails from the past 5 years. Turns out, she'd been orchestrating more than just boundary changes. There were memos pressuring board members to vote on projects that funneled HOA money into companies she had connections with. One of those companies billed the HOA for a playground renovation that never happened. Another charged for lighting upgrades that had been completed a year before the invoice was even submitted. But what really sealed it was an audio recording one of the former board members had stored on a backup drive. It was from a meeting that never made it into the official minutes. In it, Darla could be clearly heard saying, "If we can edge into Thorne's land and reclassify it, we not only expand our control, we increase our dues base. That's 5 new lots we can zone, maybe more if we nudge the lines right." No one interrupted her. In fact, someone in the background muttered, "That'll keep the quarterly budget in the green." That was the moment it all turned. With that recording, the case crossed into racketeering territory. The state attorney general's office stepped in. A grand jury was formed. Maggie called me that evening, her voice buzzing. "They're going for an indictment," she said. "Not just on forgery or fraud. They're building a RICO case." She was running the HOA like a criminal enterprise. By the end of the month, Darla was arrested outside a hotel near Flagstaff. She'd been using a different name and had booked her room with a prepaid Visa card, likely trying to disappear before things got worse. They did. News spread across the county. Local residents began attending community meetings in droves, demanding transparency and new bylaws that limited how much authority any HOA board could wield. A homeowners alliance was formed, separate from every HOA, focused on keeping watchdog eyes on all of them. As for Harmony Trails, the neighborhood elected a temporary committee to audit every financial decision made over the last 5 years. They uncovered nearly $200,000 in misused funds. Darla's name was on nearly every authorization form. I got a subpoena to testify before the grand jury. The courtroom was different this time, more formal, tighter security. I wore a collared shirt for once, left my hat in the truck. When I took the stand, the prosecutor asked pointed questions. Mr. Thorne, to your knowledge, did the HOA ever notify you of their intent to alter the boundaries of your property legally? No, I said. They tried to do it without telling anyone. Did you ever receive a consent form? A hearing notice? Any chance to dispute the boundary change before it was filed? Not a single notice. Were you ever offered compensation? Wasn't about money. They wanted control. A few days later, indictments were handed down. Darla was charged with 16 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying public documents, and embezzlement. 2 former board members were charged as well, though they negotiated lighter sentences in exchange for cooperation. Maggie and I sat on my porch the night the news broke. She brought over a bottle of rye and 2 glasses. You could sue them civilly, she said, pouring. For damages. Emotional distress. Maybe even defamation. I'm not looking to get rich, I said. I just want them gone. She nodded, then tilted her glass toward the orchard. Still wouldn't hurt to make sure they can't buy their way out and pop up somewhere else. That got me thinking. The next week, I filed a civil suit for punitive damages. Not for myself, I set up a trust to funnel any awarded amount into a legal defense fund for homeowners dealing with predatory HOAs. Maggie helped structure it so it couldn't be touched by anyone with a stake in property management. The judge ruled in my favor again. Between attorney fees and damages, the HOA's insurance had to fork over just under $400,000. Most of that went straight into the trust. After that, I didn't hear much about Darla. Word was she took a plea deal to avoid federal prison, but part of the terms barred her from holding any leadership position in a housing association or nonprofit organization for life. She'd also have to perform community service and pay restitution. I spent the next few months back in the dirt, fixing the irrigation lines and rebuilding the chicken run. I kept to myself mostly, but neighbors started coming by more often. Not out of curiosity, out of respect. Linda dropped off fresh eggs every Sunday. Carlos brought over his kid to help with the goats. Even folks I barely knew before started asking if I'd help them read through their HOA rules just to be safe. One afternoon, the new community committee from Harmony Trails asked if they could bring their meeting to my barn for the evening. They said they wanted to hold it somewhere that reminded them what the neighborhood was supposed to be about. I agreed, but only after they agreed to rotate locations every quarter so no one place held too much influence. They liked that idea. The barn filled up that night with folks in denim and boots and a few in loafers and polos, all sitting on hay bales and old lawn chairs. They talked about gardens, lighting ordinances, and how to make sure the HOA never got too big for its britches again. As the sun dipped behind the orchard, I stood up and said one thing. Power doesn't always corrupt, but it always reveals. If you want to keep your community right, don't just elect people you trust. Elect people who aren't afraid to lose. They clapped, but it wasn't loud. It was steady, like something solid setting into place. By winter, I had more peace than I'd had in years. The goats were fat, the apple trees were trimmed, and the fence line stood exactly where it always had, untouched, unchallenged, and backed by the law. And Darla? Well, the only time I heard her name again was when someone in town mentioned a woman doing litter pickup along the highway, wearing a neon vest and a sour expression. Apparently, justice can be poetic after all. Late spring brought the first real quiet I'd had in months. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle through the open windows of the ranch house, and the days stretched long enough to get everything done without racing the sun. I'd just finished re-leveling the north pasture when the county prosecutor called again. "Xander," she said, "we've got a situation. We need your signature." I leaned on the tailgate of my truck, wiping sweat from my neck with a shop rag. What kind of situation? Darla's plea agreement is being challenged. She didn't disclose a secondary trust offshore. It's connected to the funds she siphoned from the HOA. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared out at the pasture, the fence line shining in the early light like a scar that had healed cleaner than expected. She's in violation of the deal? I asked. Directly. Which means the court can vacate her agreement and pursue maximum sentencing. But we need impacted parties to sign declarations. I'll be in town by noon. By the time I arrived at the courthouse, 3 other residents were already waiting: Carlos, Linda, and a woman I didn't recognize with white streaked hair and a clipboard full of documents. She introduced herself as Eleanor Park, a forensic accountant appointed by the state. She moved large sums through textile import businesses that don't exist, Eleanor said. Registered in Belize, but the IP logs show everything was accessed from her home Wi-Fi. It's textbook laundering. So she wasn't just skimming, I said. She was building an escape hatch. Exactly. And she almost pulled it off. The prosecutor handed me a folder. Inside was a sworn statement outlining the damages, the deception, and a recommendation for maximum penalty 15 years without parole. I signed at the bottom without hesitation. The judge scheduled a revocation hearing, and this time the courtroom buzzed with more than just curiosity. Reporters packed the benches, homeowners filled the aisles, and even state legislators showed up to observe. Darla entered in a tailored blazer, hands folded like she'd just come from a business luncheon instead of house arrest. Her attorney argued procedural errors, claimed the trust had been forgotten, and said the dollar amounts had been exaggerated. He tried to downplay the significance of the trust, chalking it up to poor oversight. But Eleanor took the stand and dismantled him piece by piece. The trust was created 3 weeks before the forged plat was submitted, she said, paging through spreadsheets. It's received over 200 separate deposits, all under reporting thresholds. All from shell vendors that submitted invoices to the Harmony Trails HOA. The courtroom shifted as her words sank in. This wasn't just petty theft. It was systemic fraud, planned and executed with precision. Darla didn't even look up. When the judge gave his ruling, he didn't raise his voice or bang the gavel. He simply said, "The court finds the defendant in willful breach of her plea agreement. Sentencing is hereby revised to the statutory maximum. No appeals, no second chances." She was led out in cuffs, her eyes hollow, her lips pressed into a line that gave nothing away. After the hearing, Maggie met me on the courthouse steps. She wore a suede jacket dusted with pollen and her boots tapped against the stone like she had miles left to walk. "They're introducing a bill," she said. "HOA oversight, mandatory transparency, independent audits. Your case lit the fire." I sat on the railing watching a group of reporters huddle around Eleanor. "Didn't realize I was starting a movement." "That's how they always start," she said. "One person who won't bend." We walked back to my truck, parked crooked as ever between 2 compact cars. She paused before climbing into her Jeep. "You ever think about running for something?" she asked. "Office, county board, land commission, hell, even just the zoning panel." I shook my head. "I fight better with a shovel than a podium." She laughed and didn't bring it up again. Back at the ranch, things settled into a rhythm that didn't need fixing. I re-graveled the drive, painted the barn's west side, and turned the old shed into a smokehouse. People still came by with questions about bylaws, about property lines, about how to keep their own HOAs in check, but I never charged a dime. I just handed them copies of my case files and told them where to look. Harmony Trails changed, too. The new board published every meeting agenda online, opened their books quarterly, and even dissolved a few of the more ridiculous rules. The residents voted to remove mandatory lawn color codes and abolished the fine system altogether. They started using volunteer crews for repairs and let people plant whatever they wanted in their front yards, so long as it didn't block the sidewalk. One evening, Carlos dropped by with his daughter, Elena. She was holding a mason jar full of fireflies, grinning like she'd caught lightning itself. Got a question for you, Carlos said, resting his arm on the gate. We're thinking of building a community greenhouse. Would you let us use the empty lot by the creek? I glanced out past the goat pen. The space had been bare since the orchard expansion, but it had good sunlight and better soil. You take care of the fence line, and it's yours. He nodded, then added with a grin, we'll name it after you. I shook my head. Name it after the kids who plant there. They're the ones who'll keep it going. The next weekend, half the neighborhood showed up with shovels and seedlings. Elena painted a sign that read Sun Creek Garden, and the first row of tomatoes went in before dusk. By summer, the trust fund Maggie and I set up had already helped 4 homeowners get legal representation in their own disputes. One of them, a retired mechanic named Wes, won a case against a board that tried to evict him over a classic car restoration project. Another woman used the funds to contest a fake lien placed on her home for a mailbox design violation. The stories multiplied. People stopped feeling helpless. They started asking questions, organizing, voting out power-hungry board members, and rewriting governing documents. One night, as dusk fell and the frogs started singing along the creek, I sat on the porch with a ledger in my lap. I wasn't balancing books, I was writing down names. People who'd stood up. People who'd helped. People who'd refused to be steamrolled. It wasn't about ego. It was about memory. About making sure the right names were remembered, not just the ones who caused the problems. A truck pulled up just before midnight. It was Linda holding a box of documents. Found these in my attic, she said, handing them over. Old HOA records from when the neighborhood was built. Thought you'd want to look. Inside were faded photocopies, handwritten meeting notes, and a letter from the original developer promising that the HOA would never interfere with surrounding agricultural properties. I let out a breath through my nose. Looks like Darla broke more than just the law. She broke the first promise this place ever made. We burned a copy for the state archive and mailed the original to the new board. They framed it in the community center. By the time fall rolled in, the garden was full of peppers and squash, the greenhouse had fresh paint, and no one mentioned Darla anymore. Her name had become a cautionary tale, not a threat. I rode the perimeter of the ranch one last time that season, checking posts, tightening wire, watching the sky shift into amber. The land was quiet, but not empty. It felt lived in, protected not just by fences, but by people. Justice doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it's in the way your neighbor waves to you without fear. Sometimes it's in the way your land stays yours, untouched because you didn't back down. And sometimes it's in the silence that follows when the last lie is gone, and the truth is the only thing left standing.